So for today, I want to start by asking you to take a moment to become present. And I'm going to invite you, if you're willing, to close your eyes for just a moment. And in closing your eyes, I'd like to ask you to see if you might be able to feel some part of your body. Maybe it's contact with the chair, or maybe it's ground beneath your feet. But just aware of your body sensations, and then also aware of your breath. If your breath as it's flowing in and as it's flowing out. Then you might notice along the way also thoughts or reactions to perhaps what feels like an unconventional way of opening this kind of session. And so you're aware of breath as it flows in and out, and you're aware of perhaps the length of your body. So you have your feet in contact with the ground, but also the crown of your head that's reaching up. And in many traditions, this idea of the length of the body connects to the sense of dignity, the sense of space that we can take up. So perhaps just for a moment, you can feel into that idea of sitting tall, of resting in your own dignity as a human being. And you might also take a moment to feel into your width. So left to right, right to left. If you reach your arms out in front of you, you might recognize the capacity to say no. Or if you were to pull them towards you, the capacity to create connection, to extend inclusion towards somebody. And then also just the depth of your body. So you have the back of your body and the front of your body and all this space that's in between. The back of the body is often about our history, maybe a metaphor for all the things that we carry into this moment, the way that we've been shaped, our personal journey, our history, our cultures, our families, and how that shaping impacts the way you can relate with the world around you. And then also we have the front of the body, and perhaps the front of the body can represent looking towards the future, as if perhaps somewhere in the middle you're sitting as your best self and you're looking towards the future, maybe with curiosity. And then just lastly, tuning into this idea of three basic needs that are really shared by all people. So a need for safety, a need for dignity, and a need for belonging. And so you might be able to tune into your own needs, but also that of others, and even your ability as a person to offer and to receive safety, belonging, and dignity. And then just allowing this to come to an end. You're welcome to open your eyes if they were closed. I would invite you to carry that sense of your own ability to tap into maybe your dignity and to extend belonging, extend connection in the world. So I should tell you at the start of all of this that I'm probably somewhat of an idealist. I did invited here today in some part because I'm queer, because I'm trans, because I'm non-binary, and familiar to many working heterodox. But I'm actually here because I strive for a world where people are able to be the fullest expression of themselves. And in doing so, to experience safety and belonging and dignity, where they don't have to hide who they are in order to have access to resources like food, housing, or income, or promotion. I long for workplaces where every leader is a servant leader with wisdom and compassion, modeling and shaping cultures of safety and belonging and dignity, where all people can show up with their whole self, and in which every person is able to take responsibility for generating a culture which prioritizes this for everyone, not just those who are most represented. And fundamentally, I hope for a world where inclusion is able to happen because we're living from this place of believing in the amazingness and the goodness and the dignity of the other person, rather than approaching them as other, as in fear and mistrust, and perhaps blaming their difference for our own problems. So yeah, I'm a bit of an idealist. But here's the thing, when you're trying to get somewhere, it helps to have a vision and to know where you want to go. And for me, this is where I want to go. And it's where I hope to be able to invite you to go through the words that I'm sharing today. When I thought a bit about what I had to share related to pride, I found myself returning to the roots of pride. So pride as we know it started in the 1970s as a protest against police harassment and against unjust systems which didn't recognize the dignity or offer safety or belonging to a group of people who then were referred to as the gays. They were thought to be deviants. It was a movement led by people with some of the least privilege in the world, transgender people of color. And the current term that we have, LGBTQIA+, and growing, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, it's an acronym. And it continues to evolve since it was introduced in the 90s, just as LGB. And every letter that we've added is reflecting a piece of history. It's a group of people who fought to find words for themselves, to create space for themselves, be recognized as existing, and to have their interests represented, their dignity honored, their need for safety recognized. Because being seen matters, and being heard matters. And the act of being seen and heard by another honors, instead of silencing or stealing the dignity that's inherent in all people. So pride, it started in protest against systems which didn't offer these things and which offered harm instead of safety. And the thing is, it's still relevant today. So being visible as an LGBTQ person can result in being ridiculed, in being violated, assaulted, not protected, not served by those who are sworn to protect and serve. Politicians, police officers, doctors. You can be put to death, legally or illegally, depending on where you are. It can result in unequal job opportunities, an increased risk of homelessness, decreased quality of healthcare, increased risk of illness related to the stress of living in a society that treats you as the other, not normal. And that happens everywhere. Europe, the United States, Africa. So we're living in this world where while we might claim that we're all humans, and we should all just get along, not every human life is granted the same worth, the same privilege, the same access to resources, or even the same degree of safety. So yes, we're all human, and yet our individual lived experiences are very different, depending on the color of our skin, or the genitals we're born with, or our sexuality. And then we haven't even started on things like our age, our level of physical ability, how well we fit standards of beauty. The list goes on and on. So today, in the spirit of pride, I'd like to invite you to briefly explore gender and sexuality with me. Because gender and sexuality, just like the color of your skin, doesn't only affect some nameless, faceless them out there, they affect all of us. And starting to understand how this affects us is important, especially when we want to offer safety and belonging and dignity to ourselves and to others. So this simple declaration when a child's born, it's a boy or it's a girl, it goes on to determine a shocking amount of our lives. Like we could spend days just exploring this one little thread. This seemingly simple declaration carries with it the expectation of the colors you're going to like, the toys you might have, the games and hobbies you'll like, the social roles you'll play, the clothes you should wear, who you should be attracted to and who not, the life you might need to aspire to, the language your caretakers will use when they're raising you or describing you, how trustworthy you're perceived to be, how often you'll be listened to or interrupted in a conversation, the jobs you get, how hard you'll work to get them, how much you'll get paid for them, the way you should express yourself while you're in them, and how you might be perceived for the way that you expressed yourself when you do so. It impacts not just these external things, but also how you feel about yourself, how you feel about others, how much authority or agency we're given over our own bodies, and ultimately how much access to safety or dignity or belonging that we're given by default. It's all based on the genitals you're born with. So gender, it affects all of us. And when we're born in this particular historical setting and within that particular cultural, social, family setting. And until the day that you die, you receive countless messages about who you should or shouldn't be based upon your genitals. You're asked to prove yourself as a real man or a real woman. We internalize these. We learn how to stay within these accepted stories. And ultimately, often to feel bad or nervous or unsure of ourselves if we're not quite living up to them, or if they're called into question. So at this point in, say, Western culture, at this point in our history, we have this kind of prevailing expectation that there's men and there's women. And if you were born with a penis, you're a man. If you're born without a penis, you're a woman. And being straight is just default, it's normal. And any other form of sexual expression, of gender identity, is going to need to be announced, explained, justified, quite possibly defended against, or denied, or kept out, or maybe cured. When I was growing up, I heard that being gay was an illness, a sin, wrong, weird, unnatural, a choice. I didn't hear what science actually shows, that our genders and our sexualities are just two of the myriad of ways that humans are naturally, normally diverse. And these ways of seeing and these ways of describing, they lead to very different realities, different lived realities for real people, because they become the basis of justifying our treatment of humans that is leading either towards or away from their safety and their dignity and their belonging. So the way that we view things, the language we use, matters. And developing this capacity to reflect on the way that you see gender and sexuality, or the narratives that we've embraced, consciously or unconsciously, the way our position or our experience in the world has been impacted by these things is critical. Because it's the set of lenses through which we're viewing ourselves and through which we're viewing others. The set of lenses through which we justify our actions, which lead towards or away from honoring others and ourselves. So with this in mind, I'd like to introduce you briefly to a model of gender and sexuality that's imperfect, but it does allow for a bit of a more nuanced understanding of these ideas of gender and sexuality than many of us may have grown up with. As I do so, I want to invite you to be curious about your own experience of gender and sexuality. Perhaps to explore suspending judgment and being open and setting aside maybe what you think you know, and just explore what could be. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. And so gender and sexuality I recognize as what's called biopsychosocial phenomenon. It means that basically gender and sexuality, as with pretty much all human traits, are influenced by and influence our biology, our psychology, and the context in which we live and in which we're shaped. And I've already started to speak to that, and I'll come back to it. We can divide gender and sexuality into more than just the question of what genitals do you have, and how is that situated within our binary understanding of man or woman. We can divide them into a number of components. And in this model, we use body-based markers, which we typically would associate with someone's sex, gender identity, gender expression, your assigned sex at birth, who you're attracted to sexually, also romantically, and the way that you do relationships. And each of these components, they're all made up of subcomponents. And actually they can all be mixed and matched to create your specific map experience of your gender and sexuality. So we start with body-based markers. When you're born, you have certain physical markers related to your sex, chromosomes, hormone levels, the shape and size of your genitals. And over time, you start to display secondary characteristics, like how much hair you have and where it grows, the size and shape of your body or your chest. And all of these things are related to sex and also the perception of your sex. This is not the same as gender. And these markers, they vary for literally everyone. No two people have the same exact combination of these things. And in our Western cultures, maybe more than any other, and in particular traceable back to the period of colonizing, we've tried to classify these differences. We've tried to label them. We've reduced this whole spectrum of diversity to male or female, normal or abnormal, desirable to have or perhaps undesirable to have, a sign of worth and ability or a sign of inferiority, and therefore justifying the treatment, the privileges which might be afforded to some but not to others. And this reductionistic approach means that many of us believe that all creatures can be divided into male or female, and that's it. In nature, though, we see that these actually aren't the only options. So, as an example, one organism's been identified with what they currently think is 28,000 different sexes. They don't even know how to start counting that. And in reality, this biological component of sex is made up of a whole number of components. And each of them are functioning along kind of their own spectrum, where if you only think of genitals, it's possibly born with varying shapes, sizes, configurations of genitals, and it changes over your lifetime. Throughout your lifetime, your DNA is changing, your hormone levels are shifting and changing, your body size, your body shape, your hair, it all shifts and it changes. And so it's part of our natural, normal processes of diversity and process of being human. Now, alongside this material reality of our bodies, there is a psychological component, this inner sense of who you are that grows and develops from the time you're born. And we can call this gender identity. So our dominant Western cultural paradigm tends to be familiar with only two genders. But throughout history, there's many societies, including societies today, that define this differently. We have societies recognizing 3, 4, 5, and more genders, and they've developed different names and roles for them. And currently, there's dozens of named human genders, and many of them aren't fitting into this male-female binary way of thinking. And so we have this term, or a couple of them really, used for all the genders fitting into not male, not female, and it's non-binary or genderqueer. So we have many non-binary genders, and some people will choose to use a more specific word that identifies just their experience of gender, while others, like perhaps myself, will choose just the word non-binary. So one model that we can use to picture gender identity, it starts from a bit of a familiar reference. And it suggests that we view it as a combination of one's sense of the degree of absence or presence of maleness or masculinity, femaleness or femininity, and then genders that are outside of that binary view, whether you have a name for them or not. And so as we're continuing down this model, I'd like to invite you to explore your own unique experience of gender and sexuality. And you could do that by writing down for yourself, in this particular case, your gender identity mapped through this model. And then as we go along, we'll continue to build on it. And by the end, you have kind of a map for yourself as you understand it in this moment. And maybe that will shift or change. So as you look at this, you could think for yourself, how much or little masculinity do you identify with? What about femininity? What about something else? And as you jot that down, I'll continue forward. So we talked about body-based sex characteristics. We talked about gender identity. And then we talked about gender expression. So gender expression, it's the outward presentation of who you are. Behaviors, mannerisms, interests, the clothes you wear, the way you move, your use of language, expression of emotions. It's all aspects of your gender expression. And they're all interpreted by people through the lens of our own historical and our historically and culturally situated understanding of gender norms. In other words, there's not really an intrinsic, morally or naturally right way that you can express gender and sexuality, because they're always situated in a particular time and place. But if you consider a simple example, in the not too distant past in Europe, it was thought that wearing pink, makeup, wigs, and frilly clothes, and a lot of powder was the most dignified way that a real man could dress. And today, perhaps if you saw such a man, you might have a different interpretation. And so already there you can start to see that the expression itself and then the lens through which it's interpreted is fluid and it's changing. And yet, when any given interpretation happens to be the dominant one in a culture, it's often taken as defensively morally correct, to the point where all others who fall outside of that should be ostracized or fixed, or in some way reprimanded for their deviance. It's interesting on a side note to note that there's cultures where actually your gender expression as you get older and not your genitals, it becomes the determining factor of your gender. So you can take a moment for yourself and consider the way that you express gender. And I encourage you to write it down. And then finally, at birth, so this is our third component here. At birth, you're assigned a sex, given male, female, or intersex. Intersex is where aspects of your body-based markers don't match the binary definitions of gender and sex. When you're assigned a sex at birth, which is a term that is preferable to biological male or biological female, and when you don't identify with that sex as your gender, then you might be considered by others or by yourself as transgender. And then you may choose, or you may not choose, to opt for medical intervention or changes in outward presentation that better align with your own gender identity, as well as the current cultural lenses that are used for that identity. And with this idea of transgender and non-binary genders, I'd like to take just a little side note to talk about pronouns. So in English, male gender tends to have the words he and him as their pronouns, and the female gender has she and her. And non-binary genders have a whole variety of different pronouns because language is evolving. Currently, they and them is one of the most common. So there's a chart here. I'm not going to walk through all of it. There's many more variations, but this just gives you an example, a little flavor of how might you use different kinds of pronouns. And there's many languages where they and them, it doesn't directly translate. So actually I've included a link in this presentation, which we'll send out later, that has a whole list of many countries and languages, and it explores the different gendered and neutral pronouns that are available in perhaps your own language. The thing is that language, it's always evolving, and these words, they shift and they change over time. But it does matter which ones we're using for ourselves and for others, not as a question of political correctness, but it's part of the reality of living in a world where language is how we're representing reality. And language can carry baggage, it can make invisible or can offer safety, it can affirm dignity or not. So then returning to, so we did gender, and now we're looking at sexual orientations. So sexual orientation, relationship orientations are, again, a vast subject. We could spend a long time talking about them. But for this purpose, we're splitting it into sexual desire, romantic desire, and relationship orientation. So often in our current context, sexuality, a lot like gender, it's been reduced to a single point of understanding. So what genitals does the person that you experience sexual desire for have? And for countless people, this experience of desire is actually far more complicated. So its intensity, it ebbs and it flows. It may or may not be experienced. It may not even be desired. When it is experienced in connection with, it's often experienced in connection with particular combinations of a body shape, hair colors, personality characteristics, yeah, and emotional connections you may or may not have, and more. It all plays into this desire equation. And it's fluid and it changes for people. This model, it oversimplifies things, but again, models can be useful as starting points for self-reflection. So you could have a look at this and explore for yourself, like what are the characteristics of people that you're physically, sexually attracted to? And so then also our sexuality, it's not just about sexual desire or the lack thereof, it's also about romantic or emotional desire. And this desire to have a longer term romantic relationship with someone. So it's possible to be sexually attracted to particular people, but not necessarily want to have a long term relationship with them. Or to be in a long term relationship where there's romance and connection, but not necessarily sexual desire. And then as you age and as you go through your different seasons of life, you may find that this too is fluid and it changes. And here too, you can map this. And then we're going to get to the final piece of the picture in this model, and it's around relationship orientations, which some people would say is not a part of sexual orientation. Some defend that it is, so we're just going to touch on that briefly. However you see it, it's about the way that you're doing relationships and what all the people involved in your relationship consent to. So typical key aspects of this include the number of romantic or sexual partners throughout your whole life, but also at one time, and the degree of exclusivity, and possibly the degree of permanence. So some people, they'll choose not to have a partner. Others may choose to have only one partner for their whole life. Some may have many, one at a time. Some may have multiple at the same time. The list of ways to do consensual relationships, it goes on and on. So I'll pause for just a second and give you a moment to catch up on these three aspects for yourself, to take a little moment to see, okay, where am I? How do I recognize my own experience? And as you do, it's pretty cool. Because if you've been following along the whole time, you've mapped out a much more nuanced picture of your gender and your sexuality than maybe you ever have thought of before. And to know that everyone on this call could map their experience differently if we were to explore it with enough depth and nuance is also pretty cool. And I encourage you to continue to explore it over time, to see how it might shift, to see how your understanding of it might change. So as understanding and science and culture evolve, so does language. We continue labeling more and more of these expressions of sexual desire and of romantic desire. And so some people may choose to identify themselves with just the word straight or gay or bisexual, but many people are starting to choose words that are reflecting their more nuanced experience. So for example, you could be asexual, which is not particularly experiencing sexual attraction, and at the same time gay, desiring romantic relationships with people of your own gender. You could be straight, which you might notice I probably don't have to define for you, and aromantic, not desiring romantic relationships. And then our list goes on and on. And again, it's this aspect of the beauty of human diversity. And so for yourself, you might even take some time to, if these words on this slide are unfamiliar, to go have a look at them. See if maybe they describe part of your lived experience. And if they don't, maybe you want to hunt for other words that do. So it's safe to say that gender and sexuality are about far more than just what genitals you were born with. And if you remember only one thing, it might be to remember this, that your assigned sex is not the same as your gender identity. And neither of those things actually equal how you will express your gender. And those three things don't equal anything about your physical appearance or who you're attracted to, romantically or sexually, or even the way that you're going to do relationships. And each of these things is like its own dimension, its own spectrum that's more fluid than we often realize. And together they combine in myriads of ways, which are again part of this natural, normal human diversity, even when they feel foreign to us, even when they're outside of our own experience. So I'm gonna stop sharing these slides. I'm gonna keep talking, but I'm stop sharing slides. So about labeling, for many people who grew up straight or cisgender, which is identifying as the gender that you were assigned at birth, this need to label can feel really foreign, can feel strange. And what I would say is this: when you grow up straight and cisgender, perhaps even especially as a white person, in a world that's defining straight and cisgender as the norm, which is called cis heteronormativity, you have imperfect, but still have them, examples and role models around you in media, in films and TV, music, books. You have examples from which you can learn. You can learn what it's supposed to be straight, how to be in relationships, what it means to be man or woman, according to the dominant narratives. And consciously and subconsciously, you learn and you align with or separate from aspects of those stories and those images. And you have a language that you can use for yourself. And you have other people that use language that describes you that feels relatively congruent with your own experience. And for many of us in the global LGBTQ population, this is something that's missing. Our existence can be judged and denied and ignored, not accurately represented. And we get labels and they're not normal or different or sick or wrong. And there can be this sense of a loss of dignity, a loss of examples from which we can learn and follow, a loss of language of how to describe our experience, and sometimes even a loss of confidence in the experience itself, our experience of our own selves, because it seems like maybe no one else is like us, or everyone's telling us we're wrong or different, or maybe just confused. And so when you find words for your experience, and I speak for myself, when you find words for your experience that you didn't have before, it can be really freeing. It can be actually quite joyful to know that there's lots of other people who have the same experience or similar one. And that perhaps because of language, you might be able to find them. You might be able to describe yourself. And to know that rather than being an exception, you're just a normal human being with dignity. So for myself, each word I've discovered that accurately describes part of my lived experience as a queer, trans, non-binary person has been really freeing. Even though I hold them all loosely, I know that language evolves. I recognize my understanding and confidence in myself will continue to grow. So at the end of this presentation, one of the things that you'll get is some further questions. If you want to keep exploring for yourself, your own gender, your own sexuality, there's some more questions you can keep diving into and keep reflecting on. You might start to notice what narratives you may have adopted around what does it mean to be a good man, woman, fill in the blank. Perhaps what privileges or challenges you might have faced as a result of your gender, your sexuality, your skin color. And so one reason to do all of this work, this exploration, is to get to know yourself, which is already pretty cool. But it's also to open the door to the diversity first in your own lived experience, and then to explore how that experience might actually be different than the experience of somebody else. And if we can't explore and own the nuances of our own experience, of our own identities, we can't do that with curiosity or compassion. It's hard to give anybody else that same gift. So gender and sexuality and race, they affect all of us. They're embedded in everything. And even when we don't recognize it, they impact our understanding of ourselves and of other people. They impact the doors that are going to open for us and the doors that are going to close. And they impact the degree of safety, of belonging, of dignity, access to resources that you will or won't experience by default. And this understanding of the impact of these things is part of what's known as positionality. And so this is about a willingness to become aware of our differences and of our interconnection. Me and you, my lived experience and your lived experience, and how your lived experience might be impacted by me, and how my own impact on you might be different from what I may have intended. These are necessary foundations if our intent is to create the cultures of dignity and belonging and safety for everybody, and not just ourselves. And so it's a bit in this spirit that I want to take just a moment to share about my own positionality, my own privilege. So as an example, I think it's important that I start by saying that I'm really happy actually with who I am. And I found it incredibly freeing to let go of some of the gendered norms that weren't serving me well. And at the same time, as a queer, trans, non-binary entrepreneur who was assigned a male at birth, who hasn't opted for transition surgery, I experience some challenges. I'm misgendered all the time. There's organizations or clients that have, and they will choose not to work with me because I've made my identity visible rather than hiding it. Every interaction that I have, it requires some level of thought, of awareness, of decisions about how visible to be or not to be. Every interaction includes some degree of stress of not knowing how I'm going to be responded to. And at times it tips into a fear around violence, verbal or physical. Just in my neighborhood in the past weeks, multiple trans women have been accosted violently in the supermarket in broad daylight. So for me, every time I dress, there's this question around authenticity versus invisibility. How I'm going to dress, if that's going to prevent harassment or perhaps more disadvantages on a given day that I'm willing to deal with. And just the fact that I can make that choice is already a privilege, because I can be seen as a normal male, quote unquote, if I dress the part. But when I ask someone to use my pronouns, or if I wear pink or makeup, or if I were to put on a dress, or in any way do something that didn't fit gender stereotypes, then I'm going to be branded as different. And people will take it as their right to make comments or jokes, deny my existence, or in some other way to let me know that I'm not performing properly as someone that was born with a certain set of genitals. And some people just say, I'm flaunting my gender, flaunting my sexuality, rubbing it in their faces. But I would argue that this is just confusing existing with flaunting. It's just the act of being visible. In the same way, actually, that many other people are visible, modeling their own gender stereotypes, their own gender conforming clothes with their partners hand in hand. And all of it, it's just a lot of work and energy. But there's another side of that coin. So for most of my life up until now, I've always managed to find work, always gained access to the resources I needed to survive. People generally trust me without knowing me, and I've not been rejected for housing due to the color of my skin or my gender or my sexual identity. In general, I've always managed to find work. I've always gained the access to the resources that I needed, and even claiming my identity has opened some new doors for me. So I've benefited from factors that give me key privileges. I'm white. I was assigned male at birth. I didn't come out as non-binary until I was later in life. But people generally read me as male. I've been married to a woman for 18 years. I have two teenagers. Gives me access to straight privilege. Yeah, and this my whiteness, my male privilege, they've contributed heavily actually to people's willingness to trust me, to hire me, to give me chances, to assume that I'm capable by default, and then to put me in positions of leadership. And being raised in the US meant I was able to immigrate to Europe without an added layer of difficulty that's faced by many people from many other countries of origin. So I have access to resources that many LGBTQ people don't. Most definitely many trans, many non-binary, and many people of color. So when we take a moment to reflect, I suspect that all of us can find these ways that we've been privileged and ways that we've been disadvantaged. And when we recognize the ways that we've been privileged, no matter how small, we have this choice that we can make around how to use that privilege. And whether it's just for me to get what I deserve, or if I choose to leverage it on behalf of others. So pride, it's a call to create a culture of safety and belonging and dignity for everyone. It recognizes the importance of acknowledging our position and our privilege and using it on behalf of others, even if it's to address problems that maybe we haven't experienced. It invites us to see the natural dignity of all human life and normalize our diversity and our difference. And we can work together to create these cultures of safety and belonging and dignity. And it's good for people, and it's good for business. And I don't have time today to speak to that business case, but it's there. And in closing, so you might wonder, like, what can I actually do with any of this? What's practical? So I have a few invitations. The first is your own intention. So committing to safety and belonging and dignity for all, no matter what the department, the role, the title, the race, the gender, the sexuality. You can decide for yourself if you're willing to commit to modeling these cultures. And if you choose to do that, you can explore life from this place of fundamentally believing in the goodness and the dignity of the other, and then look for ways to create connection across the lines of separation. A second invitation would be to be curious, to take responsibility for your current and your potential impacts, recognizing that intention isn't enough. Our good intentions, they often come with harmful impacts. So we need to learn about the experiences of others, how they're different than our experiences. We need to be curious about how our actual impact, what that is on others, so we can discover how to have the impact that we're actually intending. And when they don't match, and when somebody brings it to our attention, we can take it as a moment to create connection. We don't have to attack or get defensive or claim it's not a big deal because we didn't mean it to be. Let's take it as an opportunity to learn, to grow, to be humble. And we can use as a third invitation, whatever agency you do have, whatever voice, whatever privilege, you can use it to stand up for the dignity of other people. So you can ask whose voice isn't being heard, who's excluded, who's going to be impacted by the decisions that are being made. Imagine if every meeting or every decision-making process started with a question of who's going to be impacted by what you're doing here today, whose voice isn't represented, and what do we need to do to make space for it so we can hear it? And of course, you can go on to examine structures, processes, decisions for who's included, excluded, advantage, disadvantage. And then finally, using language. It's a powerful tool for creating safety, belonging, and dignity. So language and its impact matters. It can denigrate, it can render people invisible, it can perpetuate stereotypes, it can perpetuate assumptions, but it can also affirm dignity, and it can normalize diversity, and it can invite connection. So you can consider the stereotypes or the assumptions that you might perpetuate about somebody else or about what's normal when we speak. You could use the pronoun in the language for others that they ask you to. And if you happen to see or hear some particular group or person being talked about or denigrated, you might speak up. You could challenge the status quo. But the truth is, it's not work for the faint-hearted. And if you're not feeling it already, you might face discomfort. You might face fear or questions from yourself or from others. But just know that it's not about political correctness. It's not about policing language, policing behavior. It's not about ticking a box. It's about when you know deep inside you that you want to contribute to a workplace and to a world that's acknowledging the fundamental worth and dignity of people, yourself and others. And when you want to infer that your impact is matching your intent, then you just might find yourself willing to do whatever it takes, even if it takes you to uncomfortable places, even if it requires change from you. Because you see that in that discomfort is the opportunity to close the gap between an intention of creating diverse, inclusive environments and the reality of actually doing so. And this is the invitation that's extended by celebrating Pride as a protest against injustice, which invites us to examine the contribution we're going to make. Because within each of us, it's like when we started, within each of us is the possibility of wisdom and of compassion, the possibility of allowing safety and dignity and belonging to come through you for somebody else. And so I want to thank you for letting me share these words today.